Okay. We've been going through the chapters in Mark's Gospel. We're now up to chapter 6. If you're watching this video, it's probable that you've already concluded that God exists. I'm not saying definitely that's where you're at, but it's likely that you're intrigued by the Christian teaching on God. Maybe you've become convinced of the existence of God based upon the world you see around you. What explanation is there for the fact that things exist? The fact that there is a universe? How did it all come into being? Maybe you're convinced of the existence of God on the basis of, well, we're moral creatures. We clearly have a sense of right and wrong. Who decides what's right and wrong? If there isn't an ultimately perfect, righteous, good person who has given us clarity on these things, how can we be confident that there is such a thing as right and wrong? Maybe you've reached conclusions on the basis of those thoughts. Maybe it's simply that you're looking across the vastness of the universe and you're amazed by the beauty of it, and you're convinced on that basis that there must be a God. But what about this thought? What about if this God, who is the creator, came into his creation and walked upon the earth as an otherwise pretty ordinary human being? What might this person reveal to us about God? What might we learn about God? Just think about it. God comes into his creation. God speaks to ordinary men and women, interacting with them, working among them. What might we learn about God? What might be the priorities of this God as he comes into his creation? What might be the things that he wants us to know above everything else? It's an interesting thought, isn't it? And really, the Gospels and the Gospel of Mark give us an account of the things that Jesus wanted you and wanted me to know about God. And we're able to learn so much about God by looking at the life of Jesus. He was otherwise a pretty unremarkable person. Chapter 6 begins, Jesus enters his hometown of Nazareth. And the reputation about him and his ministry in the months preceding have been heard in Nazareth. And they're incredulous. We know Jesus. We know who his brothers are. We know who his sisters are. What's all this about him having these miraculous powers? And they were offended by him. And this was saddening, really. I mean, Jesus was saddened that their hardness of heart stopped them from seeing him for who he really was. Now, that's a great question. Is Jesus God? And if Jesus is God, what does Jesus tell us about God and what he is like? Well, this is a brilliant chapter for thinking through those questions. This chapter contains a miracle that Jesus performed that each of the 4 Gospels tell us about. That's pretty unusual for all of the Gospels to tell the same account of the same miracle. It's the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And Mark tells us in the eyewitness account, this is Peter the Apostle's eyewitness account that Mark writes for us, that this miracle occurred following an extensive period of time where Jesus and the disciples were preaching, teaching, being among the people, that they were tired and worn out. Jesus said, "Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while." For many people were coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they got on the boat, and they tried to find a quiet place. In verse 34, it says this, "When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd. They'd followed him. There was no getting away from this crowd. This crowd was desperate to be where Jesus was. Having tried to find some space from them, I wonder, what would your attitude be when you find the very ones that you're wanting to get a bit of space from just running after you the whole time? Irritation? Do we get back in the boat and go somewhere else? This is what it says. When he saw them, he had compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Jesus saw this crowd and he was moved with compassion for them. That's really important. We learn that God is compassionate to people. That when God sees you and sees me, and he sees our need, our spiritual need, our material need, he's not dismissive, he's compassionate. Jesus taught them, Jesus healed them, and then at the end of the day, they are very hungry. And a boy had a couple of loaves and a few fish. The loaves and the fish are distributed among the whole crowd. In total, including women and children, around 25,000 people are fed by the contents of this boy's lunchbox. It's an astonishing miracle. Now, here's why I think this miracle is included in all four Gospels. Because it was a key piece of evidence proving the authenticity of the claims about the life of Jesus. Why, you might ask? Well, Mark's Gospel is being distributed about 40 years after the life and death of Jesus Christ. So this miracle that we are reading about here in Mark 6 happened 40 years before these reports were being distributed in a relatively close-knit community. 25,000 people were fed miraculously on this occasion. If this was nonsense, if this was just made up, then it would be very easy to go and to investigate these claims and to find them disproven. And say, oh, this is nonsense. This didn't happen. I've been here my whole life. It's just nonsense. This isn't true. We have no documentation refuting the authenticity of this miracle from the time. Why? Because it happened. And here's what I believe Jesus would want you and I to know about this miracle. It's what he went on to explain to the crowd the next day. This is recorded in John's Gospel in chapter 6. Because the crowd came back to Jesus again and they wanted another free meal. Jesus said to them, you've come not because you saw a sign, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. In other words, he's saying, you're here for another free dinner. Don't you realize what this was all about? He says to them, don't hunger for food that perishes, but for food that lasts forever. And then he went on to say to this crowd, he says, guys, you need to understand, I'm the bread of life. I'm the bread of life. You need me. The miracle of the bread and the fish, this miracle was a sign to point you to something even more extraordinary, that God has come and entered the world and is among us. God among us, God with us, Emmanuel, Jesus is God. And he's telling this crowd, I've come not just to feed your flesh, but to feed your souls. I've come to deal with your sense of emptiness, your spiritual hunger. I'm the bread of life. I can satisfy that hunger. You need me. This teaching at the time was very strange to the people who were listening in. In fact, they left. They're like, this is odd. We're off. The disciples continued to journey with Jesus and saw him crucified, saw him resurrected, saw him alive again, understood that his death was for them, that his death was to deal with their sin, understood that his resurrection meant that he had conquered death, he'd conquered sin. They understood what this meant was that all of the disappointment and the shame and the guilt and the sense of dirtiness that they felt, he dealt with that. He was feeding their souls. And he wants you to receive that bread of life as well. He wants me to receive that bread of life as well. The wonderful thing about this miracle is not only do we find every single person is fed, but there are 12 baskets full left over. What does that suggest? Surely it tells us that this miracle is abundant. And just as Jesus taught that this miracle points to the greater miracle that he's come to perform, that is the feeding of our souls, we can be confident that in Jesus, our appetite is not only satisfied, but there's an abundance. There's more than we can ever grasp hold of. And the Bible teaches we go on exploring more and more of the wonder of who Jesus Christ is and what he's done. So well done for sticking with us as we've been going through this series. I'd encourage you, please, follow on as we go through the remainder of this gospel. But today, I invite you, come to Jesus and find in him the bread of life. Thank you.